It is 12:03, so I would like to welcome everyone to this, I believe it's the 6th session of our Fall 2020 Sustainability Research and Practice Seminar. My name is Brad Flam. I'm the Director of the Office of Sustainability, and I'm very happy to be one of the offices sponsoring this, but I'd also like to let you know that the Office of Research and Sponsored Programs supports this series, as does the Office of Digital Learning and Innovation. Kristin, I'm getting that name down finally. Oddly is the acronym, I think you said. We have, so this is, will be the last of the first half. We have 6 more fascinating presentations, including next week. We have an invited guest. We don't do that often, but Mr. Thomas Lindsay is Chief Counsel for the Center for Democratic and Environmental Rights. And he's going to be giving what I think is going to be a fascinating presentation about the concept of environmental rights and how municipalities and counties and states around the country are adopting this principle as one way to work on protecting and preserving the natural environment. So thank you. Join us next week. Join us every Wednesday at this lunch hour. I'll just say thank you once again and hand the virtual floor over to our speaker, Kristin Kondrlik.
I had to unmute myself. Didn't want to begin the talk and not actually you guys be able to hear me. If you have any trouble hearing me at any point, or if there are any technical issues, please just let me know in the chat and I'll attend to those as we go forward. So good afternoon, everyone. I'm very excited to participate in this series. As Dr. Flam mentioned, I'm a professor in the English department. I teach a course called Technical Writing, where my students focus on the issue of sustainability in a modern context. But as you'll see, I primarily do archival work on the historical topics, meaning that I love to sit in libraries and dig through old texts that haven't been checked out since the 1920s. So that's where I'm coming from on this. So I came to this specific project in a bit of a roundabout way. My research comes out of my work on the history of writing and print. Because I work in the 19th century, I work primarily on historical periodicals such as newspapers, magazines, and professional journals. My main focus in recent years has been on the publication of professional societies, mostly examining medical journals and how physician writers use these publications to negotiate issues such as women entering the medical profession, smallpox vaccinations, and medical professionals being taken as prisoners of war in World War I. So this project is a slightly different avenue for me. And it began actually at my intersection, at the intersection of my own interests in vegetarianism. I've kind of been an off and on vegetarian for probably about the last decade. I'm currently off. I'll probably go back on again in a couple weeks. You know, it's one of those things. And also of my interest in 19th century wellness movements in the United Kingdom, which are a useful precursor for thinking about modern wellness movements. So 19th century vegetarians were part of one of the many emerging wellness groups in the mid-19th century. So this included groups like temperance, what's called hydrotherapy, mesmerists, spiritualists, all those kind of fun angles. And what caught my eye in reading the writing by 19th century vegetarians was how much they emphasized that eating meat could damage your ability to think, reason, and make moral judgments, and how that intersected with their desire for this idealized utopian vision of the world. So this struck me as a very different way. This struck me as very different from how modern vegetarians frame their choices to adopt a vegetarian diet. So
we're getting Zoom bombed, by the way.
I think so, yeah.
Sorry, this is me. I'm having computer trouble and I can't figure out.
Oh, Sarah's Zoom bombing us. It's an internal Zoom bomb.
Okay, so should I just keep going? Sorry. I should just keep going, correct? Yeah.
So far.
Okay. So this is different, obviously, from the way that contemporary vegetarians frame their own choices to imply, which are mostly about choices of mental and moral implications, but also include sort of discussions of what's called rhetorical citizenship, and sustainable citizenship, which I'll talk about a little bit more in depth. So this research is actually part of a set of research that I came to and was actually fortunate to win a grant through the College of Arts and Humanities, a research and creative activities grant, and traveled to the British Library in London to complete the archival component of this research. And so this talk is a shorter version of a longer chapter that's going to be coming out in an edited collection later next year. So that's the background, and so now we can dive a little bit into the substance. So hopefully we have no more issues, but it should be fine. So I don't know how to take that. I don't know how to remove that thing on the screen, but should be fine. So on September 10th, 1855, James Simpson, the president of the British Vegetarian Society, delivered a lecture. He decried the state of the common man during the age of technological, scientific, and intellectual progress. He noted that, quote, "Man groans in bondage because ignorance, error, and self-indulgence have filled his flesh with corruption," unquote. This corruption, Simpson argued, was a direct result not only of more obvious vices such as liquor, lust, or tobacco, but also of diet. Specifically, Simpson argued that an erroneous diet, including meat, influenced a person's stomach, nerves, and brain, and pervaded their body, feelings, and thoughts. These physical effects prevented individuals from becoming, quote, "aware of the nobility, beauty, height, and capacity of their existence." Likewise, Simpson argued that because meat eaters did not fully obey the laws, the quote, "laws of harmonious citizenship," there are intellectual facts and mental being into which he can never enter, and delights which he can never enjoy. So there are moral facts and moral being which can never be revealed, and degrees of moral happiness that cannot be enjoyed, unquote. For Simpson and many of his 19th century contemporaries, eating a vegetarian diet was not only an issue of animal rights. Rather, Simpson and other members of the Victorian Vegetarian Society wrote that eating meat, its moral, ethical, intellectual, and physical effects could prevent an individual from participating in a harmonious relationship with animals and with the environment. So many contemporary vegetarians and vegans retain an idea of the connection between an individual's diet and the state of society. Scholars note that today's vegetarians and vegans frequently adopt a meat-free diet for individual health or ethical concerns. Increasingly, however, advocates argue for vegetarianism and veganism on the explicit basis of sustainable citizenship, which recognizes the responsibilities of the individual to local and global communities on issues of environmental, economic, and social justice. To map the evolving relationship between vegetarianism and citizenship, this presentation will analyze both 19th century and contemporary public writing by advocates of vegetarianism. It will focus specifically on the writing of the British Vegetarian Society in order to more clearly discuss how one segment of the movement has evolved over time. I think we can also reflect a little bit on the American movement and how it might be different, because there are some slight differences, but this presentation focuses on sort of the British context, just because that's where I work typically. So in both historical and contemporary writers share concerns about diet and citizenship, though in distinct ways. Historical sources focus on how an individual can lose their ability to participate in society through the physical and mental transformations inherent in eating meat, whereas contemporary writing centers more squarely on the responsibilities incumbent upon a citizen that disallow the consumption of meat. So you may be thinking, why is an English professor thinking about citizenship? Isn't that a political science or history topic? However, citizenship has long been a central topic to the overarching project of English and specifically to rhetorical studies. The question of who has a right to speak and who does not have the right to speak and how citizens can best exercise that right has its roots in the history of our field through Aristotle, Cicero, Plato, and others. Though it is an old question, it has significant contemporary appeal. We live in times of shifting notions of subjectivity and unstable legal and social definitions of who can and cannot be a citizen. Restricting citizenship to membership in a nation state does not reflect how it functions in the world. In order to address this disparity, Robert Asen outlines what he terms a discourse theory of citizenship. Rather than seeing citizenship as a fixed identity granted or denied only by a nation state, Asen argues that scholars should move to reframe citizenship more broadly, opening up our definitions of what we mean by citizenship. Asen argues, better reflects the reality that, quote, citizenship engagement cannot be distilled to a set of rights, condition of membership, or allegiance to a cultural tradition, unquote. Rather, it should recognize that individuals act and speak as citizens in a variety of circumstances. Other scholars have expanded on the idea that citizenship is more than legal documentation. Karma R. Chavez outlines some of the kinds of citizenship practices not constrained by legal and political boundaries. So civic, community, and activist practices, sexual, social, consumer, and cosmopolitan citizenship all fall into this category. Kristin Koch and Lisa Vladson echo Asen and Chavez. Like Asen, Koch and Vladson have argued that scholars looking to analyze rhetorical citizenship should look to exercises of and limitations on what's called rhetorical agency, or citizens' possibilities for gaining access to and influencing civic life through symbolic action. In this view, who actually possesses the power to speak or to perform symbolic actions as a citizen of a particular community has greater force than possessing a legal document affirming that an individual is a citizen of that community. For example, an immigrant to the United States may possess the legal right to call herself a citizen, but her ability to participate in civic events may be undermined by other members of that society through acts of silencing or intimidation. Thus, her ability to affect change in society has been reduced. Citizenship itself, therefore, is contingent. Analyzing this contingency, Koch and Vladson argue, can lay bare the connections between the specific actions and the maintenance and development of public life. Citizen discourses, however, are not just limited to written and spoken utterances. So rhetorical studies scholarship takes seriously the role of what is called embodied discourse, or the use of the body to participate in public conversations. From voting to dancing to running to protesting, scholars argue that speakers make public arguments with their bodies. In light of such scholarship, it is not a leap to recognize how other intentional physical actions, such as eating, can be used in an exercise of one's right to speak as a citizen. Eating an animal or choosing to adopt a more plant-based diet can limit or contribute to an individual's recognition as a citizen in a given community. So I do want to make a quick note before we dig into the more analytical piece of this, that veganism was not distinguished from vegetarianism until the mid-20th century, with the creation of the Vegan Society of the United Kingdom in 1944. Therefore, as it is deployed in the mid-19th century movements, and as you'll hear me say it in this talk, vegetarianism specifically refers to individuals who would today label themselves as both vegetarians and vegans. So it's a big clump. But when we get to contemporary circumstances, when I say vegetarian, I mean vegetarian as we typically understand it now. So, as a number of scholars have noted, vegetarianism has been practiced worldwide since ancient Eastern religions and Stoic philosophers. What we know of as modern vegetarianism in the United States and Britain, however, has its roots in 18th century European humanism. The vegetarian movement became more formalized as the 19th century progressed, and the first Western vegetarian organization was formed in the United Kingdom in September 1847 as the British Vegetarian Society. The society gained popularity in its first years, but remained a relatively small organization throughout the 19th century. The current Vegetarian Society of the United Kingdom and the Vegan Society are descendants of this organization. The British Vegetarian Society's president, James Simpson, established the periodical The Vegetarian Messenger in 1849. For the next decade, until Simpson's death in 1859, the Vegetarian Messenger served as the primary voice of the society. Examining this first decade of publication reveals some of the major ideas that served to ground the movement as it became formalized. The first issue of the Vegetarian Messenger listed a variety of objectives for the society. Unsurprisingly, Victorian vegetarianism's primary goal was to discourage individuals from consuming meat. One of the primary arguments that a vegetarian diet promoted better physical, mental, and moral health will not be unfamiliar to modern readers. Victorian vegetarians' arguments also looked beyond their own individual health and happiness and flirted with popular 19th century utopian ideals. In January 1851, Simpson noted that vegetarianism's followers envisioned a society that more closely approximated humankind's full potential and, through the progress and, quote, civilizing spirit of the age, unquote, would continue the inevitable progress toward, quote, a truly enlightened and merciful civilization, unquote. So a key element for creating this civilization was the obligation for humans to live in harmony with fellow human beings, animals, and the environment. In January 1850, Simpson compared the ideal society to the interconnectedness of a tree. So, quote, every leaf, fiber, and vein has its service to perform to complete the harmony of its nature. Should not every thought, word, and action of our lives likewise serve to preserve the harmony of our own creation, unquote. Individual citizenship in this harmonious relationship relied directly on their diet for Victorian vegetarians. And it is at this point where historical and contemporary vegetarians diverge. The very act of meat eating, Victorian vegetarians argued, could rob an individual of citizenship in this harmonious community. And Victorian vegetarians argued this point in two distinct ways. So first, that meat eaters became corrupt and immoral by participating in the Victorian meat economy. And second, that meat eaters actually did damage to their physical and intellectual faculties by the act of eating meat. So many of the arguments in the pages of the Vegetarian Messenger condemned Victorian Britain's meat economy as a hindrance to the creation of societal harmony. And there's a lot of research on the actual slaughter and the associations with executions and criminals and things, and I'm happy to talk a little bit more about that when in the discussion section as well. But Simpson decried all forms of animal slaughter as a moral transgression. In 1849, Simpson wrote that such behavior represented, quote, unnatural and cruel conduct of man towards those he was designed to protect, unquote. Similarly, in June 1855, Simpson commented that the sanctity of all life, animal life, and the environment included, quote, belongs to the very genius of vegetarianism, unquote. He argued that the principles of a vegetarian lifestyle, quote, guarantee society against many of the gross and glaring evils and anomalies which now produce its greatest sufferings and misery, unquote. In the same vein, Simpson also decried animal husbandry. In January 1850, Simpson pointed out that livestock farming, quote, polluted the air by poisoning our rivers and streams, the banks of which, instead of being the most pleasing resorts for our population, were, in many instances, rendered highly offensive and unhealthy, unquote. Simpson also underlined the ecological ramifications of the meat industry, including famine, poverty, and waste. He particularly lamented that, quote, while thousands and tens of thousands of our fellow creatures are in a state of privation and want, animals were fattened for slaughter with the produce of our soil, unquote. For Simpson, the moral harm being done through the perpetuation of a carnivorous diet was not simply about humans ignoring the suffering of animals or pollution. Rather, he was also concerned about the lingering harm that proximity to or participation in this industry would have on individuals' morality, an essential part of how Victorian vegetarians envisioned citizenship. This moral harm, according to Simpson, had long-term implications for the individual's agency. Being a party to the slaughter of animals, Simpson argued in June 1850, would blunt people's feelings so much that, quote, what is an act of cruelty to those unaccustomed to such scenes appears to them as a matter of ordinary business. In January 1851, he similarly asserted, quote, if the mind become by habit accustomed to a disregard of moral convictions, the conscience becomes seared and does not act so powerfully in guarding the mind from its grosser tendencies. And thus, that which would become the greatest blessing may be turned into a dreaded curse. Unquote. Simpson argued that by participating in the meat industry and becoming inured to its violence toward animals, the environment, and other humans, meat eaters place constraints on their morality and agency, foreclosing them from full membership in the harmonious civilization the Victorian vegetarians sought. Concerns about limitations on a meat eater's agency also extended to the physical act of eating meat. Simpson and other society members asserted that meat put the eater at a higher risk for disease, characterizing meat as a poison or toxin and arguing that meat eating produced unpleasant physical symptoms such as heart palpitations, inflammation, dyspepsia, or stomach upset, spasms, fatigue, and ill temper. In a period before close regulation of food in Britain, vegetarians also worried about the dangers of food contamination, which were especially a problem in meat. Simpson also collected accounts that suggested that a vegetarian diet decreased an individual's risk for conditions such as tuberculosis, asthma, scurvy, cholera, and depression, among others. Victorian vegetarians, however, positioned meat eating as a transgression with consequences beyond physical illness. The vegetarian messenger framed the functioning of the body, the mind, and the soul as intimately connected. The 19th century represented a time of shifting perceptions on physical and mental boundaries. The science of the era rejected mind-body dualism, which is a separation between mind and body, which was more common sort of in the Enlightenment, Descartes era. Vegetarians such as Simpson argued that this meant that what an individual ate could have significant ramifications for their mental well-being. According to Victorian vegetarians, consuming meat corrupted the mind and reason via the body in a couple of different ways. So first, Simpson argued that eating meat initiated a negative physiological response. In December 1849, Simpson asserted that the habit of meat eating would make the intellect beclouded, the moral senses blunted, and, quote, our real and substantial enjoyment very much abridged, unquote. Simpson went so far as to argue that meat eating could impair the nervous system, such that, quote, the unfortunate victim is frequently sunk into the most awful despondency. Every pursuit becomes tedious and wearisome. Life itself is rendered not worth caring for. Suicide is frequently contemplated and sometimes actually committed. In consequence of this dreadful disorder, which is frequently mistaken for a mental disease beyond the possibility of a human skill to remedy, unquote. So here, Simpson linked meat eating with mental distress, which he argued could challenge an individual's decision-making and isolate him from his community. In a later lecture, Simpson argued that humans must obey the laws of harmonious relationships in order to achieve their full intellectual and moral potential. An individual who consumes meat could never be a full participant in the utopian society imagined by Simpson and other Victorian vegetarians, because meat eating placed limits on their physical and intellectual capacities. Second, and perhaps more strikingly, Victorian vegetarians argued that eating meat made humans powerless against their baser, more animalistic appetites. Victorian vegetarians argued that the physical act of eating meat would change an individual's habits for the worse. To illustrate this point, the Vegetarian Messenger often described meat consumption as making humans, quote, ferocious and cruel, unquote. In January 1850, Simpson asserted that living on prey would make humans carnivorous, ferocious, or unclean in our dispositions, practices, and desires, and that eating meat would, quote, enable us to fight and kill each other on the battlefield, just as animals delight to do in the forests and plains, unquote. The periodical illustrated the correlation between an animal-like nature and meat eating by printing accounts of writers traveling the world. In July 1854, Simpson printed excerpts of a travel diary by German novelist Friedrich Gerstacker. The account details Gerstacker's encounter with indigenous, carnivorous inhabitants of Buenos Aires. The most striking passage is the following, quote, "The inhabitants of this country, living on flesh and nothing but flesh, continually engaged in slaughtering and everywhere surrounded with blood and decomposition, have themselves grown savage and bloodthirsty, and that too often they give proof that they hold the life of a man in little higher estimation than that of a bullock or steer or a horse. Living exclusively on animal food must necessarily tend to make man ferocious, and once the hand once used to the knife becomes too familiar with it," unquote. Those consuming meat, in Gerstacker's observations, are tainted, leading those individuals into violence. In asserting that meat eating made one less human or more savage, the Vegetarian Messenger called on a very specific public sentiment circulating during the 19th century. So though this distinction between non-European savages and civilized humans actually has its roots much earlier, the 19th century saw philosophers and scientists alike crystallize theories about the relationship between these two figures. So declaring that an individual was made savage by meat eating associated the carnivore with criminality, with inferiority, and with violence. I want to note here that there's a lot to say on this point, and I cut a lot of that out just because of time, but the Victorians have a very complicated relationship to race and post-colonial issues, especially on, in countries like in areas like South America as well. So I'm happy to talk about this a little bit in the discussion. Also, I wanted to note a parallel here to the contemporary carnivore diet, sort of put forth by Sean Baker, where an individual eats only meat, and some of the discourse and discussion surrounding that, which is very imbued with masculinity and savagery. So that might be a point we also could talk about in the Q&A as well. So this descent into ferocity and away from civilized behavior was not limited to those in foreign savage nations, however. In November 1854, a Mr. White noted that eating animals put the eater's body into a feverish state, while the mind, quote, has its tone, its elasticity, and its freshness weakened through sympathy with the body, unquote. White also noted that the English staunch adherents to a meat-based diet were proverbially choleric in disposition. Here, White is actually invoking the humors, which by the Victorian era were an outdated notion that imbalances in the body and these bodily substances could lead to physical and emotional problems. So in this case, White is connecting meat eating to an overabundance of choler, or what's called yellow bile, which is associated with irritability, aggression, and ill temper. And White argued that eating meat, quote, induces a ferocity of temper unknown to men whose food is chiefly drawn from the vegetable kingdom, unquote. Though the English were not typically on a full meat diet, according to White, they were still affected by what vegetarians called a mixed diet of meat and plant matter. By consuming any meat, then English citizens would become ferocious and thus block themselves from a clear mind. So writers to the Vegetarian Messenger linked this favoring of appetites with a lack of agency, using the language of slavery and subjugation. A Cornish correspondent in July 1850 argued that the perverted appetite and unnatural passion for slaughter imposed by a carnivorous diet placed a person in, quote, fetters, a yoke of bondage, and thraldom, unquote. So similarly, Simpson wrote that eating meat developed the gross and depraved part of human nature. Therefore, he asserted, this practice of killing and of eating the flesh of diseased animals has done its part to degrade and enslave mankind, who thus become easy prey of passion, avarice, and crime, unquote. Likewise, in May 1852, Simpson noted that such an appetite for meat would, quote, perpetually subjugate individuals to conditions and states of mind which, if properly looked into, cannot but be considered as chargeable to the want of conscientious consideration, even in those who profess to regulate their conduct in accordance with the highest moral standard of truth. You can tell these guys are Victorians because their sentences are very long, just as a side note. But the main idea here is that individuals become subject to their cravings for animal meat once such cravings have been sparked, rather than active subjects or agents themselves. And these appetites then made individuals more prone to follow the sensual pleasures that allowed them to satisfy those appetites, rather than to act or speak according to the workings of their rational minds. Again, there's a lot to say here about the unspoken racial dynamics used in invoking slavery, particularly because these writers were often abolitionists in the time right into the lead up to the Civil War. So there's a really interesting valence there. Again, something we can unpick should we choose. So this slavery had serious ramifications for the meat eaters' ability to participate in Victorian vegetarians' idealized society. The citizen was to be ruled by the highest reason and morality and act accordingly, not to allow their intellect and judgment to become overwhelmed by the pleasures of the senses. Simpson declared that meat eaters, ruled by animal nature, cut themselves off from the best parts of humanity. He wrote, quote, "Can then a practice be conformable to reason and truth, which stifles the best feelings of the human heart," unquote. Adopting a vegetarian lifestyle, conversely, would help a person to be a citizen. In 1855, Simpson wrote, quote, "Man must be consistent to be happy and live in harmony with his whole moral, intellectual, and physical nature, which forbids the slaughtering and preying upon the brute creation as grounded in error, a remnant of fallen and acquired savage nature, and ultimately to disappear before the progress of a real and enlightened civilization," unquote. This harmony, Simpson and other writers indicated, could be achieved by the individual living out vegetarian principles. Britons, according to the Vegetarian Messenger, possessed elements for moving beyond their choleric temperaments and toward becoming citizens of a more peaceful and harmonious society. All individuals had to do to become citizens was to drop the meat from their diet, a task, of course, not fully realized by the time of Simpson's death in December 1859. So in comparison with the historical publications of British vegetarianism, examining the views of contemporary vegetarians is, of course, much more complicated. In the current media environment, it can be difficult to point to one organization or publication that represents the views of vegetarians broadly. Modern media and communication about social and cultural issues are much more diffuse and varied than in the 19th century. And modern media spaces are less subject to gatekeeping, and more individuals have access to technologies that allow them to participate in the print or digital public sphere. So therefore, the remainder of this presentation will focus narrowly on the corporate website of the Vegetarian Society of the United Kingdom. The Vegetarian Society's website, like the Vegetarian Messenger, provides vegetarians a wide variety of resources for practicing a vegetarian diet. It features videos and articles about the benefits of vegetarianism, recipes and lifestyle articles, and commentary about issues affecting vegetarians living in Britain. So public attitudes toward vegetarianism and its cousin veganism have evolved significantly since the 19th century. A 2018 report found that over 1 in 10 survey respondents in the United Kingdom reported adopting a vegetarian, partially vegetarian, or vegan diet. Despite this expansion, the core principles of vegetarianism remain largely unchanged. In their annual report for 2019, the Vegetarian Society of the United Kingdom lists its main mission as to, quote, "inspire, educate, and enable people to be vegetarian," unquote. Strikingly, their mission statement echoes the utopian ideal that Simpson and his fellows held up in The Vegetarian Messenger. Their vision is, quote, a world where everyone is a vegetarian, unquote. They list a number of goals that align with the benefits of adopting vegetarianism as laid forth in the Victorian era. Healthier and more happy individuals, less violation of animal rights, fewer instances of economic inequality, and the creation of more sustainable foodways. Though it focuses less explicitly on the creation of an idealized society in its marketing, the Vegetarian Society of the United Kingdom, much like its ancestor, seeks a more moral, healthier, and happier society through the broader adoption of vegetarian principles. Despite these similarities, the attitudes towards citizenship in historical and contemporary vegetarianism are distinct from each other, especially in the ways they emphasize the effects of a vegetarian diet upon the individual. The contemporary society emphasizes the physical effects of a plant-based diet. The page Why Go Vegetarian asserts vegetarian food can be really good for your health. The website assures readers that a vegetarian or vegan diet can include all of the nutrients included in meat and animal byproducts, and that a vegetarian diet is naturally high in fiber and low in saturated fat. In addition to dietary benefits, the website also features a number of articles that highlight recipes, tips for balancing nutrients, and testimonials from celebrities, chefs, and social media influencers. To promote these health benefits, the Vegetarian Society's website also provides a story of a cartoon man who improves his health through vegetarian dietary practices. And you see an image of that on your screen right now. A video on the website titled "Alan Wishes He Loved His Waistline" details the declining physical health of Alan, a middle-aged man who has let his attention to his own physical health slip. The narrator describes Alan as feeling, quote, under the weather, unquote, and notes that Alan's step, quote, didn't feel quite as springy as it had been before the big 4-0, unquote. Alan decides to try cooking a vegetarian meal, and the video ends with Alan and his wife cheerfully toasting to Alan's culinary success. The video focuses on the physical benefits of a vegetarian diet, indicating studies on reduced risks of cancer, diabetes, and heart disease, as well as the potential for restoring the spring in Alan's step. Notably absent from these discussions about the health benefits of vegetarianism is the early society's focus on meat eating and a loss of intellectual ability. The videos, articles, and website do not make an explicit argument that eating meat will make an individual violent, muddled in their thinking, depressed, or unable to contribute to society because they prioritize the pleasures of the body over the intellect. Similarly, the contemporary vegetarian society does not directly conflate eating meat with individuals becoming more savage or less human. Instead, the website encourages skeptical eaters to start small by first cutting back on meat. For example, in another video on the website titled "Matt's a Cat Man," cat lover Matt makes a plan not to eat anything with a face, and that's quoting from the video, for 5 days out of the week. The website also redirects readers to everymealcounts.org, which emphasizes a more incremental approach to adopting a vegetarian diet. So the contemporary society discusses individual health behaviors and health benefits in ways that do not impugn the citizenship of the meat eater in the community of humans, animals, and the earth. The contemporary society instead takes a gentler and more inclusive approach when focusing on the physical and mental effects of eating meat. I just love that image. It's like bananas. Rather than suggesting that individuals exclude themselves from this harmonious community when they consume meat, the contemporary society leans on the obligations that the individual has to their existing community. Most notably, the organization's website emphasizes the need for individuals to eat less meat in order to protect animals and the environment. The main reasons page on the site notes that, quote, vegetarian food is better for animals, unquote. The site goes into more detail about animal slaughter and animal rights in the United Kingdom. In order to prevent such pain and suffering, the individual has an obligation to cut back on their consumption of meat. The video titled "Matt is the Cat Man" lays out his obligation for humans to animals. So the main character in this video, Matt, who you see in the image there, loves his cat, but he also loves burgers. So we get this image once he comes back from the pub, and he has this sort of moral dilemma. And he The narrator draws the viewer's attention to the disconnection between Matt's affection for his cat and his consumption of meat. The narrator notes, quote, "Cows and cats have quite a lot in common," and that Matt had a eureka moment one day that showed him his obligation to all animals. Afterward, Matt adopts a flexitarian diet, which allows him to reduce the number of animals killed for food in a given week. This video draws on the ideas that humans can sometimes be blind to the similarities between different kinds of animals. Eating meat in the video argues, does not mean that a meat eater does not care about animals at all. Instead, it acknowledges that individuals may have different relationships to different kinds of animals, that we as a society have been conditioned to view certain animals as less worthy of our care than others. And so this video seeks to extend the obligation of care beyond pets and outward to animals we often associate only with food. Finally, the contemporary vegetarian society also emphasizes the obligations a citizen has to the environment, particularly to reducing the effects of climate change. The Society's website notes that a vegetarian diet is, quote, "one of the best things you can do to stop climate change," unquote. The website raises alarms about projected population gains, that the world population will likely increase to 9 billion people by 2050. It asserts that we are consuming the planet's natural resources faster than the Earth can replenish them. Currently, the page suggests the world's food habits are endangering the Earth and people and animals that live upon it. The page of the website devoted to environmental reasons to adopt a vegetarian diet also notes that a plant-based diet produces less emissions, saves water, and reduces land usage. Therefore, in order to preserve a harmonious relationship with the environment, individuals have a responsibility to reduce their meat consumption. The final video on the website focuses on individuals' obligations to preserve the earth for future generations. Winnie Loves Adventure discusses Winnie, an older woman who has traveled across the world. After learning more about climate change, Winnie wonders whether her grandchildren will be able to enjoy the world in the same way that she has. The video contrasts an image of Winnie cheerfully trekking up a mountain to her granddaughter standing in a forest of stumps, which you see on your screen there. The video notes that livestock causes more pollution than the world's entire transport system, and that animal husbandry consumes a large amount of resources, including fresh water. Learning this information, Winnie switches out her sausages for beans and tomatoes because she knows that this change will use less water and land and help to protect the planet from harmful greenhouse gases. Winnie's choices mean that, quote, "everyone can have a chance at the next great adventure," unquote. This video emphasizes the importance of reducing meat consumption for preserving the environment. Individuals not only have an obligation to protect the earth for the earth's sake, rather they have an obligation to protect the earth for the sake of other humans. In conclusion, discussions of citizenship have not faded in contemporary discussions of vegetarianism. Rather, they have evolved. Like the Vegetarian Messenger, the website of the Modern Vegetarian Society emphasizes a sense of harmony between humans, animals, and the environment. However, the contemporary version of the Vegetarian Society focuses less on excluding individuals from full membership in an idealized world and more on emphasizing that as citizens of the current society, vegetarian or not, individuals have obligations to preserve the environment, protect animals, and improve their own health. They can do so, the Vegetarian Society argues, by reducing the amount of meat in their diets, even if they do not eliminate it completely. The connection between diet and societal issues, such as economic inequality and environmental concerns, has become more of a focus of the vegetarian movement in the United Kingdom, although it has long been a concern. This becomes especially important as the realities of climate change and our obligations as both citizens and members of society become increasingly evident. So let's talk. Thank you. So I'm going to stop share.
Thank you, Kristin. Yeah, we normally keep this informal. So please, if you have a question, unmute yourself and ask away. Oh, and it looks like Cheryl's already stolen that image for her background.
Oh, I love it so much. I knew you'd like that, Cheryl.
I have a question.
Okay.
Oh, who was that? Who did I speak over? Amy?
Go ahead.
I was waiting for Cheryl's turn. I have questions too, but I don't know in what order we want to take this in. So it's like Walt's ready to go too. I was just going to say, it's really interesting. I like how you sort of outlined this this progression from these Victorian ideas of a society being almost something that only humans are a part of, and that in order to be a part of this society, you have to sort of cut yourself off from your own animal nature and be something sort of above and other, something almost entirely spiritual and not physical, to really separate yourself from that. And then in this more modern idea, you know, where the humans are almost caretakers, where animals and the planet, that they're sort of a part of society, but they're not exactly citizens either. They're just things that we have a responsibility towards caring for, and that although the inclusion in citizenship is more inclusive in the new model, where people aren't being shamed, you know, and excluded from that by eating meat. I also wonder if you see a future where maybe the next stage of this would be extending citizenship beyond human animals into the non-human animal. You know, extending the same rights to the right to live and the right to, you know, their own version of happiness and well-being. Do you see that as like potentially being the next phase in this progression?
Yeah, I think that the sort of the limitation that exists on your second point in this particular study is that I have very narrowly focused on the sort of corporate side of this. And that's purposeful, obviously, to kind of track this one organization. But I mean, you already see movements for, you know, recognizing animal rights. I'm just on a broader scale, even legally and as citizens and as actors, I'm thinking about, oh, there was that case of that animal who took a picture. I don't know if anybody's familiar with this. There was a copyright case about an animal who'd taken a photo and whether the animal owned the photo. And so it was this conversation that was happening, and I don't actually remember, because I know there was one result and it got overturned, but there was this sort of idea that can this animal own this thing? Does it have that right? It's not quite a citizenship question, but it is a right to live, right to exist, right to be a producer of things, that kind of connects into that. So these conversations are definitely happening already within the areas of vegetarianism more broadly. It's just, unfortunately, because we're looking at the sort of the corporate entity, it's a little bit more conservative on that point. And on your first point, I think what's so interesting to me about the Victorian attitude towards this is you can begin, just because it is, I'm looking at Britain particularly, this class stratification that happens. Animals are of a different class and type than humans. Humans are in a harmonious relationship, but they are above everybody else. But even within that human category, you have issues, right? When you talk about the differences between civilized people and savages, that's absolutely part of that overall hierarchy. And like, I think in some ways, you know, makes this just a super rich thing to explore. And I've really enjoyed getting to learn about that a little bit more myself.
Yeah, awesome. Thanks, Kristin.
May I just quickly jump in and say it is 12:50, and normally at this point we pause and say thank you again. And if anyone does need to leave to get ready for another class or another engagement at 1 o'clock, please feel free to log off. But Kristin, if you're available to continue the conversation, I encourage everyone to stay on and continue this Q&A.
Yeah, I'm good. So thank you if you have to go, but I can hang out for a bit.
Yeah, I was wondering when you were talking about the Victorian approach for it, how much, and you were just talking about class, how much, if you've run into anything that showed, like, were they trying to, like, were the vegetarians aimed at just like upper class or middle class? Did they even touch it? Like, not even the question of like, you know, those foreign heathens over there that live in the woods, but like the people living in different, you know, different,
Yeah.
you know, the poor in Victorian and how that touched things.
So what's really interesting about the members of this movement is the folks doing the writing and the publishing are generally going to be upper class folks, the moneyed class. But a lot of the people that they're promoting to are individuals of the working class, because the appeal of vegetarianism in a lot of ways in the 19th century is this is a lot cheaper. The average person can go out and buy, you know, cabbage and potatoes and porridge and subsist on that. And there's a lot of interesting stuff going on within the publication about highlighting, and I think this is why so much of it falls on the sort of physical effects, is you're still going to be strong and be able to do your work and be vital and go and work all day and come back and, you know, be available to your family and whatever, if you eat a vegetarian diet. Because that was the sort of major concern of a lot of people was, if I eat a vegetarian diet, I'm going to get weak, right? And we still hear that today, right? Like, I need my iron and I can't get it in a vegetarian diet, that kind of stuff. I think the other sort of interesting thing that's happening too is there's a big emphasis on the Scottish people and how Scottish people in that period, I guess, were purported to eat less meat, survived on, what is it? I think one of the quotations is like something like porridge and oat cakes or something like that. And it's like, okay. But there's this big emphasis on you as a working class person can definitely do it. And the membership tended to be a little bit more upper class, but they did recruit a little bit from sort of the working class as well. So it's very interesting in that way, because it is a very justice-centered movement, because it does align with things like the peace movement and temperance as well.
So my question is about those stages in its evolution from 19th century Victorian outlook to 21st century. So I guess presumably the vegetarians' concerns about the environment probably come in about the 60s and 70s of 20th century. But what about the concern for animals and animal cruelty? Didn't the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals come out of that era also? And then when did that start to overlap? Do you have any indication? You know,
in the journals, there is a lot about animal slaughter and a lot about cruelty to animals. There's 3 pages that I cut that are specifically about the live markets in London. So if you're not aware, it's sort of similar. I guess the closest thing that we have now are what are sometimes called wet markets. I know that's not the best phrase for it, where people would buy livestock and it would be slaughtered either on site or, you know, they would take the animal or whatever away with them. And there was actually a movement right around 1849, 1848 that actually pulled in a bunch of writers who were not necessarily vegetarians themselves, but were very concerned about the ways that specifically cattle were being treated. And it's really violent stuff, and really, I don't recommend reading it if you have a weak stomach. It's not pleasant. But there was this push in right around when this publication started, to recognize that. And you see references to it. So Charles Dickens actually wrote quite a bit about this in his publication, The Household Words. And a couple of other journalists within that wrote on it. And Dickens himself was not a vegetarian, but you can see Simpson citing that and pulling in passages from Household Words. And so it is there. I think the focus is in a lot of ways about the fact that, you know, we're supposed to be humans and above animals, but we shouldn't be making ourselves savage by slaughtering them or something like that. So
in that way, do you feel that, you know, what you read from the Victorian period that spoke about animal slaughter and cruelty, did it still then in that way feel like it was, you know, focused on the, you know, the effect of that violence on the human that is doing the that is committing the violence, you know, like it seems like they're starting to maybe grapple with that idea, but do you feel like it's accurate to say that they were more concerned with the way that it would affect the human that is doing the slaughtering, and how it was sort of a mar maybe on their spirit and on, you know, or do you feel like they were do you feel like that they were starting to maybe be concerned about like the animals, you know, ability to suffer, you know?
It's a tricky thing to map. That's like the difference there, I think is, I think it's a great question. I don't know that I necessarily have an answer for it.
Cool. Yeah. I can imagine that would be a tricky one to be able to sort of like what it was that was compelling them to, you know, to think about those things.
Right. I mean, especially because I was looking mostly at the effects on the human as opposed to the effects on the animal. But I think it comes I would have to think about that. I think it's a really interesting question, though. Definitely. There's a fine distinction there that I don't quite have.
I have a question, but I'm happy to let someone else jump in if someone who hasn't posed a question yet would like to.
I think you're good.
Well, I'll go ahead then. I was curious about the timing of the establishment of the British Vegetarian Society in the 1840s and the connection to British imperialism and perhaps the example of Hindu society in India that is largely vegetarian and I believe was at the time. I'm just wondering what connections the Vegetarian Society made to the violence and the savagery that accompanied British imperialism. Was that part of what you read in The Messenger as you were doing this research?
So as I mentioned, the folks who were actually participating in this movement were generally very social justice focused and actually quite progressive for their time. So there is a lot of recognition of the bad things that Britain was doing, but then you also get this sort of recognition of, well, this person went to Buenos Aires and they said that everybody's savage, so, and there's not a mention of this sort of imperial aims. So it's this weird sort of cognitive dissonance that they're living in, that they're very, and I think you see the similar thing with slavery, right? Talking about slavery as, you know, something that is encapsulated, you know, can capture you if you eat, you can become sort of in a mental slavery with other things. And then, you know, they're mostly abolitionists because they're all associated with the peace movement and things like that. But at the same time, they'll go on to decry, you know, African, you know, deep dark Africa, right? And the way that animals are treated in those countries as well, and the way that people eat in those countries. So it's this, there's definitely a tension there. And I'm trying to remember if I saw in my research any specific references to Hinduism. I know it's referenced because a lot of times what they'll do is kind of do a history and a sort of international view of things. But I think they admire, in sort of my recollection of that section of the periodical, they admire those movements, but in a lot of ways they see those movements as separate, because they're connected to a different religion in some cases. You know, this is the vegetarian movement actually very long. there's a very complicated, like, actual formation of the society. It comes out of the Bible Christians movement, which is related to Swedenborgism and all of these really complicated religious and sort of pseudo-mystical movements that have roots in the Enlightenment. And are coming out of those different figures. And, you know, you see figures like Percy Shelley engaging in it, and a couple of like William Cowherd is a big name in there. But I think there's just a lack of acknowledgement that, in general, that the East, as they would say, quotation marks, it has this sort of major culture of vegetarianism, and because they do posit sort of the utopian ideas, but instead of pointing to India or to other countries that have a primarily vegetarian diet, they point to ancient Greece, for example, or they'll point to the pre-lapsarian Garden of Eden. Man was perfect, and then he ate of the tree of knowledge, and now he eats meat, because Adam and Eve definitely weren't eating animals, like we know. So I think that's a tension that's definitely there for sure.
There's another tension that I'm thinking of, speaking of cognitive dissonance, where vegetarianism isn't at all disassociated from cruelty. So in Nazi Germany, right, Adolf Hitler was a vegetarian.
Yeah.
I did not know that.
Yeah, it's one of those. Yeah. I don't know what to do with it. I mean, I think I don't know. I mean, do you know the reasons why he adopted that diet particularly?
No, there must be some kind of mystical.
Yeah, I wonder if it's related to this, maybe some of the stuff about clouding of mind and intellect, and
Could be.
I can't speak specifically to the German movement, just because I know Germans had lots of problems with meat. Sarah
typed into Google, why was Hitler a vegetarian? And Wikipedia says several eyewitness sources maintain that Hitler was a vegetarian because of his concern for animal suffering.
He did love animals.
Oh my gosh.
This is just, there's apparently a
So
whole
bizarre.
Wikipedia. Like, this wasn't the Wikipedia article on Hitler. This was like, there's this whole article on Hitler and his vegetarianism. So,
well, and it ties into sort of different ideas about who, not even about citizenship, but humanity, and who has the right to be recognized as a subject, right? And if we're thinking about, as Amy sort of suggested, the movement of animals towards being maybe recognized as subjects, Hitler's in that sort of weird category where, weird category.
Don't look for consistency.
I know, right? But it is about the view of the different classes, right? And the different ways we talk about humanity and subjectivity. And in that particular case, that view of subjectivity is not dissimilar to the way that some of the Victorian vegetarians looked at savages, right? And there was a section of this that I wound up cutting out, but there's a lot of discussion, especially around this time period and as the century progresses, of people coming from Asia and from Africa and from the South America, Latin backgrounds as being of a criminal class. I think you get that later on with the sort of Cesare Lombroso sort of criminal type. And there's this sort of idea that your genetic makeup makes you less human. And I think that, I mean, in a sort of weird way, there's a logic to it, but it's not a good logic. Not one I want to subscribe to, let's just say.
Yeah, it seems so often that trying to not be animals causes so many other problems, because problems with race and gender and class just get thrown into the mix so often, all because there's such a fascination with being something that's not an animal, being something that's like more than that.
Well, or just wanting to exclude people from citizenship and being able to have agency in a lot of ways. Yeah,
that's true.
And I mean, I was heartened by looking at some of the more recent materials, because they are more open, right? They're not saying you can't be in our ideal club and have a say in our ideal club if you eat meat. They're saying, no, we can kind of ease into things and make it more flexible, which is nice.
Yeah, I've seen a lot on just sort of Twitter conversations talking about food, and particularly for people who've had any sort of food insecurity or fat shaming or diet fads. And I don't even know if it's a movement, but just this push towards just sort of just eat food. there isn't a wrong food to eat. And I think some of this is tied into like the fat positivity and people going, some people are just big. But sort of getting into a recognition that like people are different bodies and they might need different nutrients, and there isn't a one size fits all diet, which came to me when you were talking about that, the modern thing where they're just like, not saying if you eat any meat you're contaminated, but just saying eating meat has a lot of high social and environmental costs, try to reduce that cost. I can see how that can be like sort of starting to acknowledge almost like some people might just have different genetics and that might make a vegetarian diet harder for them. I'm not qualified to say that they couldn't get every nutrient from it, but it just might be their body might be a little more resistant to it or something. So I liked that. I think that was a good approach. I thought I had a point.
Yes, that's interesting. I mean, I think especially with contemporary wellness movements, I mean, there's so much ideological stuff going on behind things like the paleo diet and I think it's the caveman diet is the Sean Baker.
I was looking that up. He was the one of the proponents did give themselves scurvy, because I remember Twitter was highly entertained when one of them gave themselves scurvy by just eating meat.
Right, and I think was it James Blake, musician,
yeah, or
also gave himself he gave himself scurvy. You know, and it is connected to sort of it's the opposite thing, and it's one of the things that I'm sort of interested in looking more into is we have this idea of, you know, the fact that eating meat makes you stronger and more powerful. And so oftentimes male vegetarians, especially in sort of contemporary times, get framed as emasculated or weak or feminized in ways that are just gross and speak to a lot of internalized misogyny. And I mean, and those diets are not doing anything. I mean, you could speak to maybe paleo is a slightly different case, right? But, you know, eating all meat is, I will say patently, is a bad idea.
Yeah.
For a variety of reasons, right? And so I think that you can't escape the social and ideological standing of food, right? It is a part of the deal.
Yeah. Oh, and then you get into like, as I was saying, you know, like some of the people I follow on Twitter grew up in food insecure childhoods, and just sort of like that just kind of screws you up, like your whole relationship to food, because you need it to live, and if you didn't have regular access to it, like it just sort of really affects everything. And then you think about, you know, the people in food deserts where maybe they want to eat fresh produce but can't afford it or can't get to the market where it is, and end up eating, you know, maybe a high meat diet because all they can afford is, you know, like Burger King and McDonald's, or those places where you just need the calories. And
Well, and attaching, oh no, Amy, go ahead.
Oh, no, I was just going to say in that way, you know, it is, you know, it's nice to see that the movement towards vegetarianism is, you know, trying to push for being more inclusive, because I think that there is also still this stigma with class where, you know, if you say you're a vegetarian, it's like, well, that's great for you that you can afford to be choosy about what you eat. You know, and I've heard that argument, you know, a few times where it's almost like the person that is saying that they're vegetarian is being sort of jabbed at and made fun of for being like some really prissy, you know, like, oh, I only eat, you know, like organic, fresh, you know, like as if it's like some snobby act to say that I'm better than you.
Yeah.
You know, and I have this restrictive diet.
Well, and I can speak from personal experience. I became a vegetarian when I was a poor grad student because I could not afford meat.
Right.
Like, honestly,
right.
Like,
Yeah.
I ate a lot of beans and rice and put a lot of, you know, Frank's Red Hot on it, and like, get some frozen vegetables, and that's I'm good for a week, right? Like, so I think food culture is just such a rich issue, and I think there's just such interesting work going on in the field right now that I'm happy to contribute. So thank you, Walter.
Yeah, and then this also ties into like land management and practices, because you get into like community gardens and use of urban space and greening of urban space by having gardens and, you know, all the benefits that brings. But then you get into questions of like, who owns the space and who can do that. And
at some point, you and I are going to have a conversation about the Fruitlands, which is this utopian 19th century commune that existed that was vegetarian. And so there are these connections to this sort of commune vegetarianism where these rich people or pseudo-rich people or people who had rich friends would buy them large amounts of land and they just kind of go and do their thing. I know Fruitlands was one. I do not believe Oneida, which is in New York, which is one of the big groups, communal groups in the 19th century, one of the more well-known ones. I don't believe they were vegetarian, but there's definitely that element in it. I mean, in the UK, they weren't so, I think it's mostly just they didn't have as much land in some cases. So they couldn't really do that kind of stuff. So there's an interesting connection there too.
Yeah.
Kristin, you've been really generous with your time. We're about 25 minutes past our normal end time. And I'm so glad that you were able to stay on and have this conversation.